Hi, everybody. As Perry mentioned, I'm Nathaniel Stinnett, the Executive Director. And Perry, thank you again so much for being such an important part of the EVP team and leading these phone banks. I am really excited to give you a quick briefing on some of the voter data that we're seeing in New York and some of the opportunities that we see for the environmental movement in New York State this year. And so I'm going to share some slides here. And before I jump into this, I just want to say what I am not going to be doing is giving an overview of what we do at the Environmental Voter Project. For those of you who are new to EVP, Perry will provide a little bit of that after I am done. But what today is going to look like is first, I'm going to give a short, maybe 12, 13-minute briefing on New York voter data that we're seeing. Then we'll have a 6 or 7-minute Q&A session with me. If you're an already trained caller, you can then start making calls. If you have not made calls with EVP before, you can then train with Perry. And then after the calling session, you can come back and provide feedback and debrief, and we'll give you some data. So without further ado, let's get started. The only thing I will say about the Environmental Voter Project as overview is we are a nonpartisan nonprofit that is just laser focused on two things. One, we identify already persuaded environmentalists who don't vote. And then two, we turn them into better voters. That's it. We don't try to convince people to care more about climate. We don't endorse candidates. We don't push particular policies. Instead, what we do is we find the people who don't need their minds changed. They just need their behavior changed. We find already persuaded, dyed-in-the-wool super environmentalists who aren't voting, and we deliver behavioral science-informed messaging to them to get them to vote. All right, why is New York important? Well, when we look at our voter data in New York, we have identified over 1.1 million already registered super environmentalists in New York who have never voted in a midterm election before. For those of you who are familiar with the Environmental Voter Project, you know that we identify these people by building predictive models. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, very quickly, these are the same tools that sophisticated Senate and gubernatorial and presidential campaigns use. They will poll tens of thousands of people, work with data scientists, and find people on voter files who have a really high likelihood of listing climate and the environment as their top priority. All right, what's some context for those 1.1 million registered environmentalists in New York who have never voted in a midterm? Well, there are 13.4 million registered voters in New York. But as you might imagine, we don't have all registered voters show up for every election. The last time there was a midterm election in New York, 6.1 million people cast ballots. So what does that mean? That means our target population is equal to about 18.8% of all ballots that were cast in New York last time there was a midterm. Am I claiming that all of our targets are going to show up to vote? No, by definition, they are unlikely to vote, or we wouldn't be delivering them voter turnout messaging. But it isn't like this pool of low propensity environmental voters is small in New York. In fact, it is extraordinarily big. It is extraordinarily big. So before I get into that chart that you see at the bottom, which describes to you a little bit about what we know of these low propensity environmental voters, let me first talk to you about why New York is particularly important in 2022. I think many people who pay even a little bit of attention to New York politics recognize that it's very important on the local level, it's very important on the state level, but it's not always important on the federal level. That ain't the case this year. According to Cook Political Report, there are currently 9 competitive congressional districts in New York. So that's the 4th, the 17th, the 3rd, the 18th, the 19th, the 22nd, the 1st, the 2nd, and the 11th. Don't worry, we'll come back to them. You don't need to remember them. But just to give you some context, even if we just take those middle ones, the toss-ups, those 4 toss-up elections, those are elections that are so close that these political prognosticators don't even want to say that they're leaning Democrat or leaning Republican. That is more toss-up congressional races than any other state in the nation. I'll say that again. New York currently has more toss-up congressional races than any other state in the nation. And then if you expand out to ones that lean Democrat, lean Republican, likely Democrat, likely Republican, that's 9 competitive. That's tied with California for the most in the nation. So New York is a big deal this year. It's a big deal this year. All right, let's go back to that slide that I was showing you before. When we talk about these 1.1 million already registered to vote super environmentalists in New York who have never voted in a midterm before, what do we know about them? Well, you'll see down here that we've broken up some demographic groups into EVP targets. That's these 1.1 million. And then it's all registered voters. Now, to be clear, EVP targets are registered. So it's not like our targets are unregistered. So those EVP targets, they're a subset of the broader registered voter universe, because we are targeting already registered voters who deeply care about the environment. They have just never voted in a midterm before. So what do we know about these people? Well, they are very, very young compared to the overall electorate. That shouldn't be surprising, right? We're going after people who are highly likely to list climate as their top priority. But what I can tell you is they're less young than we see in other states. So when you look at that 18 to 24 and 25 to 34 age range, that adds up to about 63% of our target voters. Whereas the overall electorate in New York, that's only about 22%. Well, in many states, EVP's target population, those 18 to 34-year-olds, they make up much more than 63%. In some states, they make up as much as 75 or 80%. So even though our target population is young in New York, it's not as young as we see in other states. A different way to put this is in New York, 65 and older people are much more likely to list climate as their top priority than we're seeing in other states. All right, we also in New York see a pretty significant gender gap. It's actually a sex gap. Voter files track sex rather than gender, but we see a pretty significant gender gap, not quite as large as we see in some other states, but in pretty much every age group, these climate first voters who have never voted in a midterm trend female rather than male. We also see that these low propensity environmental voters are much more likely to be people of color than they are to be white. Now, that is not coming from New York's population of Black voters. You'll actually see that our target population has a smaller percentage of Black voters than the overall population of registered voters in New York. But the population of Hispanic and especially Asian American and Pacific Islander voters is so disproportionately large in our target population that ends up skewing our target population strongly towards people of color, really strongly towards people of color. You'll see Asian American and Pacific Islanders make up twice as large a percentage of our target universe as they do the overall population of registered voters in New York. So that's just a little bit of insights into who these people are that we are going to be canvassing, calling, sending digital ads, and direct mail to. All right. I am going to just drill down a little bit on those 9 competitive congressional districts. So New York has many, many more congressional districts than that. But remember, I told you that there are 9 congressional districts that the Cook Political Report views as competitive. And so we're just going to very quickly drill down into those. And again, forgive me that this is going to be very quick, but I want to get to the Q&A and then get to mobilizing these people. As you can see, in these 9 competitive districts, all of them are either, R plus 11 or lower, or D plus 10 or lower. Now, what do we mean by that? What we mean by that is if there is a totally even election across the country where Republicans and Democrats are getting the same amount of support. In the 1st congressional district, we would expect a 5 percentage point lean towards Republicans. So the 1st congressional district over the last 2 midterms and 2 presidentials trends Republican by 5 points. You'll see the 4th congressional district trends Democratic by 10 points. All right, when we look at these first 4 congressional districts, we're talking about Long Island here. So 1, 2, 3, 4. That's where those 4 tight congressional districts are. When we talk about the 11th congressional district, we're mostly talking about right here where my arrow is, Staten Island, and I believe there's a little bit of Manhattan in there as well. I know there's a little bit of some other borough in there, but it's mostly a Staten Island district. Forgive me for not knowing what a little bit of the other borough is. Then, when we're talking about the remaining 4 really tight districts, we're talking about the 17th, the 18th, the 19th, and the 22nd. So we're talking about the Hudson Valley and then extending over to like Binghamton and up to like Syracuse and stuff around there. So this run over here. This is where these really tight competitive congressional districts are. And as you see in the column over on the left, or all the way over on the right there, EVP has a significant number of targets in these really, really tight districts. Now, we are going to be mobilizing voters across the state. We probably won't have enough money and enough volunteers to mobilize everybody evenly all the time, every day from here until November 8th. So we are going to pick and choose which places to spend most of our resources. But I did just want to highlight these 9 particular congressional districts because for obvious reasons, they're ones that people are really, really focused on. That being said, I will say that there is a really, really important statewide climate bond measure that I believe has a little bit over $4 billion on the line, maybe a little less than $4 billion on the line. It is a big, big deal. And so we're not just talking about congressional races, there are also state Senate, state assembly races, things like that. I want to finish up and get to the Q&A. Why are we calling now? Well, there is a primary coming up on the 23rd. Not only is it important that climate voters show up to change who wins those elections, but when we fast forward to this fall, to November 8th, the single most efficient way to make sure that new climate voters and new environmental voters show up on November 8th is to get them to show up in a lower turnout primary. And that's for 2 reasons. One, voting, like pretty much any behavior, is potentially habitual. You get people to do it, they are then more likely to do it the next time they have an election. But 2, whether you vote or not is public record. It's public record. And believe me, campaigns look at it. And so if we get one of these low propensity voters to vote in their August 23rd primary, by the end of September, that public voter record will be updated. And then anybody who is running for anything in these congressional races will see it and they'll say, holy moly, if Joe Smith voted in that low turnout primary in August, he's definitely going to show up to vote this November. We got to go get him. We got to figure out what issues he cares about. We got to send canvassers to his door. And it's like we have turned this low propensity environmental voter into a first-class citizen. So we're going to get to the Q&A, but we would love to have all of you stay on for the phone bank that's coming up, because it is a really easy way to turn non-voters into voters. We would love to have you canvass, and we would love to have you work with us throughout the fall. But for now, I would love to get to the Q&A.
Thank you, Nathaniel. Very, very informative. Before we get to the Q&A, we were benefiting from the crowdsourcing of intelligence among our attendees here today. You mentioned that one district that was mostly Staten Island, and you're wondering where the little piece of it. Apparently, it's Brooklyn, according to Paul, who lives in New York City. So thank you for that, Paul. Douglas Land also mentioned that there's a special election in New York 19 for an open seat that is also on August 23rd, and that is also considered a toss-up. We had one question from Anne, and then I also have a question after we get. So Anne is, I think, within the context of the fact that there's so many competitive races this election, why is that? And she's asking, is that because of redistricting?
Yes, it is because of redistricting. Some of you who are maybe more familiar with New York State will know that the reason there are 2 primaries this summer was because redistricting took longer than it normally does. There was a very aggressive Democratic gerrymander that was drawn. It then had to get scaled back because the court said, nope, you can't do this. It is a slightly less aggressive gerrymander now, but because of redistricting, that's why so many of these districts are so close. And Doug brought up that the 19th has a special coming up on the 23rd. And I'm so glad you brought that up, Doug. A poll just came down on that, saying that the Republican is ahead by 2 points among likely voters. That, pretty much doesn't mean anything. I mean, I will give a gold medal to anybody who can determine who a likely voter is for a special August election. I think it's just pretty safe to say that that special election is a pure, unadulterated toss-up, and it's happening in 8 days. So that's such an important thing to remember. Thank you for bringing that up, Doug.
Great, and I'm going to call on Doug. He has his hand raised. There's a few of you had a hand raised. I'm going to try to do it in the order in which your hand was raised. So Doug, you have your hand raised if you want to ask a question to Nathaniel.
I was just going to follow up on that, but actually ask a question. Given that, does that help at all target for this week? Because I mean, it could be beyond just identifying primary voters. It could actually have an impact on the makeup of the House of Representatives.
So that's a great question. The people you are all calling this evening are all in the the 7th. Let me just check this so I make sure it's absolutely right. Yes, they're in the 17th, 18th, 19th, and 22nd. So we are absolutely going to burn through every single number we've got in that congressional district where there's the special. So that's going to be the first thing we exhaust, without a doubt.
Awesome, thank you.
Before we get to a couple more hands raised, I just want to mention what Anshul did it in the chat. For those of you who don't see it, on the August 23rd primary, the starkest difference on climate between the candidates seems to be in New York 17. So it's kind of not a question there, but just kind of an FYI. Bill McCabe, you have your hand raised. Feel free to unmute yourself.
Great, awesome, thank you. And thank you, Nathaniel, for putting this together as usual. I just have a quick point that I wanted to make. I was at an event last week for climate change and environmental justice in Harlem, and one of the speakers was Emily Maxwell, who's the New York Division Cities Director at the Nature Conservancy. She mentioned, just to make it a point to keep, I know we're not supposed to emphasize that to vote yes or no for the Green Bond Act on this that's on the ballot in November, but she did mention that a lot of people, she sees a problem with a lot of people aren't going to flip. It's on the back, I guess, of the mail-ins, and she said that she thinks it might be a problem. It may be a problem to just tell everyone as much as you can, not about to vote yes or no, but at least to tell them to at least flip the ballot because there will be a question, just to in general say that there'll be a question on the back, because she said it looks like it may be a problem this upcoming election.
Right. So thank you, Bill. So this is so important, but it's also important to understand sort of some context here. When calling people today, we are calling people who will not see this bond question on their ballot that Bill is bringing up.
Okay,
But
sorry,
this,
thanks.
yeah, but this November, as Bill mentioned, there is an extraordinarily important climate funding bond measure that will be on the ballot. And Bill, you're absolutely right. When we put together scripts so that people can call and mobilize Environment First voters for the November 8th elections, we are absolutely going to be making sure that part of that script is telling voters, hey, you got to look at the back of your ballot, and we're going to have sample ballots and things like that. We can't fill it out for people, but we're going to make sure that they know that. But I'm still very, very glad that Bill brought that up, because again, this highlights that mobilizing voters for primaries isn't important just for the primaries. It is also an extraordinarily high leverage way to make sure that these people vote again this fall. And if, as Bill mentioned, and I'm sure he's 100% right, that the proponents of this bond measure are a little worried that maybe they won't harvest as many votes as possible because some people are going to go and vote. They're not going to know what's on the back of the ballot. Like, we got to get as many environmentalists out as possible for these elections. So thank you for bringing that up, Bill.
Great. We're going to do one more question before we start making some calls. Alan, you have your hand raised. Feel free to unmute yourself.
Thanks. My question is not about New York, but it's more about the EVP process in general. I've seen, how you do the comparisons with a control group to gauge your effectiveness. I wonder, have you ever broken out to see that any difference in effectiveness between phone banking and postcards and digital ads?
Absolutely. So thank you for bringing that up, Alan. And just very, very quickly, for those of you who might not understand what Alan was referring to when he brought up randomized control trials, what we do is, let's say we identify 1 million unlikely to vote environmentalists. Before talking to a single one of them, we randomly separate them into 2 groups. A control group that has about 20% of our targets. We never talk to them. We set them aside and we never talk to them. The remaining 80%, they're in our treatment group. They're the ones who get our behavioral science informed, canvassing and calling and digital ads and direct mail and postcards. And then after the election, because whether you vote or not is public record, we can determine how much we increase turnout over our control group while controlling for all outside variables. Bill, to get to your question, we measure our impact along 2 axes. One is efficiency, one is effectiveness. Pretty much effectiveness means how much can we boost turnout? Efficiency means how much can we boost turnout per volunteer hour spent or per dollar spent. Without a doubt, the most efficient is digital ads. So for time and money spent over new votes created, that is the most efficient. Direct mail is also pretty efficient. Calling is pretty efficient. Postcarding, oh my gosh, like not at all efficient because it just takes an enormous amount of time for people to write postcards. Effectiveness, without a doubt, the most effective form of voter turnout is still one human being talking to another human being at their door. Door-to-door canvassing still has the highest ceiling when it comes to boosting turnout. Now, it's not always terribly efficient, because maybe in 2 hours you can knock on 60 doors, have 15 conversations, and so it takes a while to get that up there. Other things that are very, very efficient, very, very effective, direct mail. So not postcards sent from volunteers, but direct mail. And actually, phone calls can be, it's not that they can be enormously effective. They have a pretty low ceiling. It's about a 0.5, 0.6% boost in turnout, but they're very efficient. So for the amount of time a volunteer spends making calls, it's the amount of time all of you spend on your phone bank tonight. we probably are going to be able to have conversations with 200, 250 voters. And my guess is anywhere from 5 to 10 of them will end up voting even though they otherwise would have not voted. And that is an enormous return for the amount of time and money that's put into it. You brought up postcarding. That's the last thing that I'll mention. Yes, postcards. The Environmental Voter Project did not do postcards for 2 years because we had yet to see a single randomized control trial telling us that they actually increased turnout. And it was very important to us to always be able to tell our volunteers and our donors that their money and their time was actually making new votes. Then last year, for the first time, we saw 2 randomized control trials that showed, yes, there was a certain kind of postcarding with a particular design and perhaps most importantly, a particular message that did increase turnout over our control group. And so that is when we started doing postcards, but we kept a really tight rein on it. Instead of saying, you can use whatever design you want, you can say whatever you want, we said, here's your design, here is your script and what you have to say. And we're still waiting for the voter files to be updated on that. They still have about, at best, a 0.7, 0.8% boost on turnout as their ceiling. But we at least now are confident enough that postcards can increase turnout that we are asking volunteers to do that. The final thing I'll say, because I know we want to get to the postcard, to the phone bank. We had so many people do our postcarding campaigns earlier on this year. So we had 4 postcarding campaigns earlier on this year, that when we announced our ones for the fall, they immediately filled up. And so although we are postcarding this fall, it is completely filled up already. So I apologize that we don't have room for postcarding anymore, but we've got lots of room for phone banks and lots of room for door-to-door canvassing. I actually think there are going to be some people canvassing door-to-door in the 19th Congressional District in New York this weekend. So we've still got all that. That's it. I really want you guys to have lots of time on the phones because we've got some really important specials, some really important primaries. And as I mentioned, 4 toss-ups on November 8th, 9 competitive House districts, this enormous climate funding bond measure. New York is important in 2022. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. And please, run through the finish line. Stay on this phone bank until the very end. You are using scripts that we have seen in randomized control trials increase turnout. We would never ask you to do something that we don't have evidence showing that it actually boosts turnout. So please stay on, talk to these voters this afternoon and this evening, and let's make some new environmental voters.
Great. Thank you very much, Nathaniel.